talking God, kings, and kingdoms. This week, Uncle Sam, born of a woman. Come on in, let's check it out. 1 Samuel chapter 1 to chapter 2, verse 10.
All the Bubbas of the world, we got one mission in mind.
Welcome to the Biblical Channel. Always glad somebody's showing up. We love the Bible here. We think the Bible makes an improvement on everybody's life if you read it right. And so get a grip on the Bible is kind of our theme, and just really being able to read the Bible, understand the Bible, say your prayers, get together with other people and talk God. That's the whole name of the game. And to have fun talking God, because God is having a lot of fun with the material he put together for us. And if we're not having fun while we're reading our Bible, we ain't reading it right. And so God's main concern is to get us away from the bullshit to the holy shit so we can, well, start shooting the shit and maybe sound like we know our shit. But he's very kind and patient while we get there. And so we just pray that our soul might magnify the Lord, says Aunt Mary, imitating Aunt Hannah. And we're going to talk about Hannah, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But rejoice always, pray continually. That's the name of the game. Give God all the glory, and let's have some fun. Okay, where we're going to be is 3,000 years ago. The story, the setting takes place, in the books of 1 Samuel. And then we're actually going to keep going to 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, and all of that in the original Hebrew, to sound all smart, well, anyhow, the way that the biblical material comes to us, this was all one book. It was called Kings and Kingdoms, baby. And God has a lot to teach us about kings and kingdoms, about his own plan, his own storyline. But as always, God sets it up so that we can see some characters in action and learn lots. That's how he does it. So, that's where we're at. We are in 1 Samuel chapter 1, and we're going to go over to chapter 2, verse 10. And so as we open up here into this book, the first line is, there was a certain man. Now, it's always important when we read our Bibles to get everything situated where it should be, and that means that this sounds very much like the previous book. Well, the previous book is actually Ruth. And Ruth belongs in the period of the Judges, which is the previous book, the book of Judges, and that storyline of the book of Judges. So when we open up 1 Samuel and it says there was a certain man, it sounds like there's going to be another judge, and there was, and there will be. But there's going to be a transfer and a transition away from the Judges. The fact of the matter is, the period that is called the Judges, it ain't working out very well. The theme or the motto of the book of Judges is everyone did what was right in their own eye. And so we see the storyline that God had begun, in Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Moses, that story where God made a people, brought them out of Egypt, brought them to Mount Sinai, talked with them, eventually got them across that Jordan River and into the promised land, and defeat, the job was to defeat the Canaanites because God had placed a judgment on them. But now it was time to live under God's rule, man, to live under God's rule. One might say a theocracy. We'll talk about that in just a moment, but that is the scene. That is the setting. And so when we come into 1 Samuel, we have to recognize we're coming out of that period called the Judges. So, and that period of the Judges probably was, somewhere around 1500 BC to 1100 BC. Our storyline is situated in 1100 BC. And the other thing about the Bible, it gets a lot of heat from a lot of people, but it situates itself in history like no other. It's a real history book. Maybe it has some fantastical stuff that's more than people can digest, like the parting of the Red Sea. But the situation is all very historical, and it's historically accurate. In fact, a lot of what we know about history came from the Bible's recording because there was no other people group recording stuff. The Bible's quite unique. God's book, quite unique in its historical framework and its real reality in the way that it works. So anyhow, there we are. As we come into 1 Samuel, there was a certain man. So we have this kind of expectation that we're in the judges' time, but the period of the judges did not go well. God has to continually raise up a judge to save Israel because they keep drifting off and getting, well, I just call it navel gazing. They're navel gazing with the Canaanites rather than being an influencer with the Canaanites. Rather than bringing the good news to the Canaanites are bringing the good news to the Israelites, and then God allows the Canaanites to get strong and to defeat them. And then Israel cries out, "Oh God, why are we in this trouble?" It's very human, man. It's just the way we all work. Why are we in so much trouble? Would you please save us again? And so we get this cycle going in the book of Judges where God's like, yeah, okay. And he keeps raising up these judges. And the judges that God raises up, are also indicative that things are not going well, because most of the judges in the book of Judges, they are not the heroes that we would want our kids to aspire to be. They have moments, but the rest of their life is in shambles, and the rest of their life is quite suspect, that kind of thing. There's really no great character in the book of Judges except for one, and that's Deborah. Deborah is the judge that really kind of outshines all of the other judges. Every other judge does their job and has their moments, but they also have tremendous weaknesses. Deborah doesn't seem to have any weaknesses. So that goes a lot to say about how God values the women. The women, are completely valued by God. And indeed, God is not, the misogynist that everybody claims that God is. He has a great place for his women, and it's the women who show up the men most of the time. And that's going to be the storyline here as well. So that's our situation of life. That's our context. So we have a storyline that's going to involve Elkanah, who is a dude, and he has two wives, Hannah and Peninnah. And then there's another dude named Eli. Those are the four characters, and three of those characters are introduced in the first two sentences. But there's also something else that should, catch our reading ears if we're going to read the Bible right. And that is, it jumps off the pages that all of a sudden we have a story about a barren woman. Now, this is interesting. This is interesting because if we read the account of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 3, only 3 chapters into God's book, and we are told that the problem really rests on the problem of good and evil, and that human beings are rotten at determining the difference between good and evil. We have more subjective measurements than God does. And that the reality of this world is that God's going to let this world go on with human beings deciding what is good and what is evil. But God also makes a promise. He says, I'm going to do away with evil one of these days. And I'm going to do away with evil through a son that'll be born of a woman. So once again, the woman occupies really the central place of the heroic storyline that God is bringing about. And so we remember that. And we also remember that, in the book of Genesis, when God decides to really put the story in motion, he puts that story in motion with Abraham and Sarah. And Sarah was barren, and she was an old fart. I mean, a really old fart. The womb was dusty, if you know what I mean. And lo and behold, God makes her pregnant. And then when the story advances a little bit, there's Rachel, Rachel can't have kids either. And Rachel will be, the eventual mother of, Joseph, who is, out of the 12 brothers of Jacob. I'm sorry, out of the 12 sons of Jacob. Joseph is the one who shines, but he's the one who's beat up. He's the one who is marginalized, mistreated by his dorky brothers. But Rachel too was barren. She was barren for like 25 years. And then, the storyline continues. So what we feel like, oh, and then in the book of Judges, there was Samson's mother, and she's kind of a derelict, and also seemingly, barren as an older lady, and she too is the beginning of something good that God is going to do. So our ears and our reading mind ought to be, turned up whenever all of a sudden our story drops a barren woman into our lap, and that barren woman is Hannah. And this Elkanah has two wives, Peninnah and Hannah. Now, Hannah being barren, all of a sudden we should be saying to ourselves, this is turning out to be a quirk that God has, and it's a fun quirk, and it will continue to be a fun quirk. And I love the fact that God has this quirk that not only does he like to use common people in his story, the unspecified person, not the pretty people, not the spit shine people, but he also has a penchant. He has a great interest in the lowliest, of women who are barren. And so he's going to use barren women in his storyline like no other. And of course, if you read toward the end of the Bible, you know that, spoiler alert, Mary, is an extraordinary woman and an extraordinary pregnancy. And Jesus' story, before Mary, begins with his cousin, Elizabeth, or Mary's cousin Elizabeth, who is also an old woman, and she is barren, and she laughs like Sarah. So God has this quirk. He loves using women and especially and pregnancies in the advancement of his storyline. And this is a big advancement in the storyline, because we're going to move out of the book of Judges, and we're going to move into the period out of the time of Judges and into the time of Kings. And so Hannah is going to be the woman on focus, and she is a real woman, and she is going to give birth to Uncle Sam, and I encourage all of us to see all of the characters in the Bible as our relatives, to come into the family and to bring on them in a very personal way. So I see Samuel as Uncle Sam, and I see Hannah as Aunt Hannah. I see them all as my aunts and uncles. This is the great story. It's a great story because God has put it together. So that's the quirk here, is that our ears have been perked by the fact that Hannah is barren, and we can almost guess that she's going to have a baby, right? I mean, we can almost just say, yep, she's going to have a baby, and it's going to be quick. But before we go any further, I think we got to address the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is polygamy, right? Or bigamy at least. Elkanah has two wives. And once again, people run around, say sassy thing. The fun suckers of the world like to pretend like they know what the Bible's talking about. And they say, well, the Bible, God was okay with polygamy. The answer is no, it's not. There's the storyline of polygamy and bigamy is that this is man's idea. This is not God's idea. You will not find one verse in the Bible that says, yeah, go ahead, men, and have multiple wives. Nope, that's not God's idea at all. In fact, the Bible is relatively silent. I mean, I say relatively, when it comes to polygamy or bigamy, there's really no text that condones it, meaning gives it the okay. And there's no text that condemns it, giving it the not okay. But the one thing that can't be missed is that every example of polygamy or bigamy that is given biblically is a bit of a disaster. Starting out with Abraham, and now with Elkanah, the disaster is predictable. Two women who have to share a husband, I don't know. And I know some people would like to make the case that, well, there was some goodness in that, trying to protect women. Maybe, that's fine. But this is man's idea. This is not God's idea. Let's keep it straight. And so God will work with it because God is patient and he's kind. But this is just man's idea. It's not God's. And when it comes to God's idea, well, God's idea, he has made pretty clear. In the second chapter of Genesis, he reveals that his big plan is for man to leave mom and dad and to cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one, And then, of course, the implication is they're having sex, and then they're going to become moms and dads. And this is God's plan for governing the world. This is God's plan for populating the world. This is God's plan for managing the world, to raise up more and more godly families. So the moms and the dads are at the heart of the story. And there's no child that has a mom and two dads. There's no child that has a dad and two moms. Biologically speaking, I know there's a lot of people in our lives that we hold very dear, and they become like parental figures to us, and that's totally fine. Nobody's saying anything bad about that. But we are, being serious and recognizing that God said, the normal way that I'm going to do things here is that a man and a woman will leave the mom and dad, and the two shall become one. Not the three shall become one, or the 10 shall become one, or the 70 shall become one. Nothing like that. Nothing crazy. And so it needs to be said that this is, it's kind of like slavery. Once again, man's idea. And maybe we could even say the same thing about, two people who happen to be the same gender, and they love each other, and, they're going to take a different course. The fact is that these are all man's ideas, and we can't be surprised when they're difficult, when man's ideas, run into difficulties, and the Bible portrays polygamy and bigamy, as a great big headache. And in fact, it is the undoing of many of biblical characters. And so there's no thumbs up given here. Slavery, kind of in the same boat. God's like, well, that's your idea, not mine. And if you do it, make sure that you treat people kindly. Make sure that you do people well, do people right, if that's what you're going to do. But he doesn't say do it, and he doesn't say don't do it. He leaves mankind with a lot of discretion to do their thing. So let's just drop it and move forward. There's another side note that I think we need to cover here, and that is God's government. Biblically speaking, people, again, the fun suckers say, well, the Old Testament's about a theocracy, and theocracy is what gets humanity in trouble. And I'd say take a close read, and we get a little picture here when we get to verse 3. Now, this man used to go up year by year to worship and sacrifice at Shiloh. So this is theocracy as God defines it. God defines theocracy as this: God will provide the rules, he'll provide the laws. Human beings and God will provide judges to judge the law. And there's no executive that God gives. So there's no executive branch. There's the judicial branch, and there's the judicial branch, and then there's the legislative branch, and God creates the legislation. And the fact is that God's idea of a theocracy involves an awful lot of self-government. I hope you're starting to see the connection here, because John Locke saw this connection as well. The founders of this country called the United States of America saw this connection as well. Many other people saw this connection as well. Is that the truth of the matter is God does not support a monarchy. He's not into monarchies. He's not into nations. This is all man's doing. Do good by each other. If you get into trouble with one another, get somebody involved that will judge, and judge it by God's laws. That is, and if you actually if you actually do good by God, then the law never really comes into play. It's really quite easy. Pursuing happiness, life, liberty, equality, these are all God's ideas from the very beginning. And his real idea is for families to self-govern. The family unit is God's system of government. Theocracy is a direct, executive function from God to the family. He does not pick up the phone and talk to the president of the United States or any king of the past, really. And this whole section of the kings that we're going to look into, kings and kingdoms, it was doomed. We knew it was doomed. Moses said, you're going to ask for kings and it's doomed. But God's going to let you do it, because that's the way God is. God will say, God is the author of saying, well, do what you want. You're going to anyhow. And then we'll talk about how it works out. And anytime we have a venture as a human being that goes off course, what do? When I say off course, getting away from God, what do? Well, we need forgiveness. And that is the message of the Bible. Every time we get off course, we need forgiveness. And the only place to get forgiveness is God. And God is willing to forgive. And Hannah knows that. And Elkanah seems to know that. The Old Testament characters, the OT baby, seems to understand that pretty well. Now, on the whole, people were not managing themselves very well. The book of Judges shows that people are not managing themselves. They're not governing themselves very well. And inevitably, they're going to ask for a bad government. And that's the plight of human beings. We are always suckers for bad government. I don't want to cut into our main story here. So let's just get back to the main story. And the main story is just this. The main story is that God is putting together a personal story for humanity. And through these characters, through Elkanah, Hannah, and Peninnah and Eli, God is going to take very average, ordinary people in their circumstances to reveal what he wants us to see in a very personal way. And so that's what God is doing. The main story involves these characters, but these characters are showing us something that we should be taking away. So that brings up a great question, and that is, the fun suckers of the world seem to have given up on the idea that God can even be known. The Bible takes the very clear, perspective that God can be known. The Buddhists think that God can be known, but just not personally. The Hindus think that God can be known, but just not personally. And the Muslims or the Mohammedans, they think that God can be known, but they say, but don't you dare get too personal with God, or he'll smite you, he'll kill you, or something. I'm not trying to cause fights. I'm just saying that they're very, very, very tentative about treating God personally, and they do not encourage God to be treated personally in any way. The Jews knew that God, could be known and that he could be known personally, but they also say, well, it's kind of complicated. You got to be careful, about, the personal side of God. And then Jesus comes along, Christianity comes along, and Jesus says, oh yeah, God can be known, and you ought to know him as a father. Gosh, it doesn't get much more personal than that. So that is the backdrop here. God is revealing how he should be known. And so Hannah is going to occupy the center stage in this story to show us how God should be known. So God introduces himself and he proves his existence by just using and speaking about all of the things around us. He uses nature, he uses family, he uses marriage, he uses government, he uses jealousy, cruelty, envy, sadness, joy, happiness. Hannah, Elkanah, Peninnah, Eli, they're very, very common people. There is nothing worth noting about these people. And that's how God rolls out his story about how we ought to know God. And so really, I want to say this is a story about hillbilly love, because these people are from the hill country. When it comes to Elkanah, he's from the hill country of Ephraim, and so is Hannah, and so is Peninnah. So, then the two characters of Elkanah and Eli, take, kind of the stage, and they show what is once again very common, and what is very common and typical is an insensitive man. Elkanah thinks he's funny. I almost imagine him hiking up, his wife is very sad about not being pregnant. And, he kind of makes fun of the situation. Hey, am I not like 10 sons? Hey, look at me. I almost imagine him hiking up his dress, and showing his, under stuff and being laughing. And she's like, that's not getting it. I want a son, man. And then Eli, the priest, he thinks, she goes to God in prayer, in the temple, in the traveling tabernacle that probably at this point, had some wooden structure and whatnot to it. And he's there and she's praying. He says, what are you, drunk? Which kind of gives us an inside picture as to the way Israel's, I don't know, their inside life is. Eli just thinks she's a drunk woman, which must be typical. And Hannah says, I am not drunk. I'm not drunk at all. It's sad. Well, note that for a second. But before we move on, so we have these two typical insensitive men involved in Hannah's life. And then we have Peninnah, who is very fertile, apparently, out of the two wives. She has kids, just by looking at her. And then she's also pretty cruel. And it shows us that Elkanah doesn't really do a very good job of managing the household. I don't know, Peninnah is allowed to be cruel. There's also something very interesting. A friend pointed out to me, last week, that it's very interesting that it seems like the cruelty of Peninnah really only happens once a year whenever they do this big family camp going up to Shiloh. And think about, the only real, obligation that God puts on people in the old part of the Bible is to come worship him, once a year, and to, rule themselves by his laws, and if you do it, then, it's all big happy camp. And it seems like once a year, it is a festive atmosphere. Going to the temple is festive, it seems. And it's kind of interesting that it's only during this time of year that Peninnah gets to throw her barbs and jabs out at Hannah. Now, maybe on the family ranch, Hannah lives in a different tent and she doesn't get to see Peninnah very often. Seems like Elkanah loves Hannah more. Seems like Peninnah is just, the baby factory. And that's just my guess. I don't know. I have no idea. It doesn't tell us that much. But then the spotlight turns on Hannah. And what's very, very telling about Hannah is that when she goes to the temple, it's very clear that she has a very personal and deep relationship with God. And where did she get this idea that she could have a personal relationship with God? Well, from the first 5 books that Moses, wrote. That's really all these folks would have had, as their main, word of God. And so from the first 5 books of the Bible, Hannah has worked out that she has a direct and personal relationship with God. She speaks to God very directly. She speaks to God very personally. And it's very sweet and it's very tender. And she has all the trust and confidence in God. And she just lays out her heart. She just lays out her heart. Well, who told her she could do that? Well, Moses did, and God did by, bringing the first 5 books of the Bible. So there's a lot of people that like to say they like Jesus books, but they don't like, the old books. And don't forget, Jesus really liked the old books, and the old books teach us about that deep and abiding personal relationship as much as the new books do. Well, anyhow, in the storyline, God rings the bell. And Elkanah and Hannah, do have sex when they get home. And bada bing, she's preggo. And once again, God is going to use the familiar and the common in his story. Uncle Sam is born, and Uncle Sam sounds a lot like the phrase, I asked God. That's what his name seems to mean, I asked God. And God is going to advance his storyline through Uncle Sam, who is born of a woman. And Hannah is her name, and she is a real woman. One of the more interesting sides to this is Elkanah, because Hannah keeps her vow. She says, I told God if I get pregnant, I'm going to give this baby, to the priesthood, and I'm going to keep my promise. And so she does. But Elkanah goes along with it. You'd almost expect him to say, no, we're going to keep this baby. But Elkanah seems to maybe redeem himself because he goes along with it. He redeems himself as being a godly man and recognizes that what God has done in Hannah is extraordinary. And he trusts that Hannah knows what she's doing in this relationship that she has with God. And so Elkanah follows Hannah's lead on this. And then we come to Hannah, the real woman who is the hero of our story. The real woman who is a hero of the story knows God in a big way. And so she is given space for her and credit for her own song. Mind you, Mary will use Hannah's song in her own song about her own son, Jesus, and her own relationship with God. But Hannah knows God, and she knows that her heart exalts in the Lord. That's a real woman. And that her strength is exalted in the Lord, and that her mouth derides God's enemies, and that she rejoices in God's salvation. That there's no other like God, she says. That there is no other like the rock who is God. Hannah knows God, and she knows God from just the first 5 books of the Bible. And she knows him well. She said, don't speak proudly. Don't speak arrogantly. The Lord is a God of knowledge. He is the source of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, she said, and the feeble, they bind on his strength. And the Lord kills and brings to life, and he brings down to Sheol. You see, Hannah actually knows from the first 5 books that God has the power over life and death, and that God can actually resurrect from the dead. He can actually take out of Sheol and bring to life again. He raises people up. Ladies and gentlemen, this is why Jesus is a big fan of the old words, because the old words revealed the same picture that he gives. Jesus is simply teaching what we should have got from the old part of the Bible. Hannah also knows that this God is the God who raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap. He makes them sit with princes as an inheritance and a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. Meaning that God sets the pillars of the world on the average common people who the world disregards. Ladies and gentlemen, Hannah is a real woman who knows God in a deep and abiding and real knowledgeable way. And that is what God is commending to us. And that is what we should be taking away from a real woman who is going to give birth to Uncle Sam and who is going to set Israel's course into a new direction through God's direction. But Uncle Sam is born of a woman, a real woman. And we ought to take lessons from this real woman, just like Elkanah seems to take lessons from this real woman. So get busy. Model yourselves off of this real woman like God is telling us to. All right, that's it. Catch you next time.